But my talk's a little different. It's going to be more from a policy perspective. I've spent the last 30 years working in areas where there's been an intersection of science, public policy, and regulatory oversight. The first part of that was working at the Department of Agriculture, where I ran the biotechnology, biologics, and environmental programs. I also was administrator of the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service and the Food Safety Inspection Service. Now, the Food Safety Inspection Service, I remember instituting a program looking at hazard analysis critical control point for looking at pathogen control. At DuPont, I've had the ability to work in the areas of biotechnology, nanotechnology, and most recently synthetic biology. And my role as global director is I get asked by the businesses very point blank, what do I need to do? How do I make this decision? And so what I'd like to talk about this morning is really what I see as one approach to answering those questions. And that approach really deals with three components. Talking about credible and reliable information, supportive government policies, and risk-based framework for decision making. I think probably all of you would agree that if we have very credible, reliable information, we have regulatory policies which are allowing you to utilize that information, and we have a systematic, comprehensive framework for making consistent decisions, that would be one approach to utilizing traditional and alternative testing strategies for making responsible EH&S decisions. Now, there's a lot at stake, clearly. Nanotechnology is helping to considerably improve or even revolutionize many fields, including information technology, energy, medicine, security, food safety, and transportation. You know, there are a lot of articles out there dealing with what's the economics of this technology. There was a small research company called BCC Research. It had the following to say about the benefits of nanotechnology. It said that the global market for nanotechnology was valued nearly at $20.1 billion in 2011, should reach $20.7 billion in 2012, but total sales are expected to reach $48.9 billion in 2017, after increasing at a 5-year compound annual growth rate of 18.7%. Now, how many of you would like to have that as a return rate in year 401? I don't even want to think about what we get, you know, on our interest in our money in the bank, but 18.7% compounded annual growth rate. So clearly there's a lot at stake, but there's this challenge. And I was looking for a quote, and I thought Andre had it in one of his most recent articles. He talked about that the production of engineered nanomaterials is a scientific breakthrough in material design and the development of new consumer products. While the successful implementation of the technology is important for the growth of the global economy, we also need to consider the possible environmental health and safety impacts. So clearly we have these benefits, but we have this challenge. How do we do this in a responsible way? And that involves the decisions that we make, but that all starts with the data, the information that we're given. I want to give a shout out here to the center as I look at your mission, using a multidisciplinary approach to conduct research, knowledge acquisition, education, and outreach to ensure the responsible use and safe implementation of the technology in the environment. This will allow the international community to leverage the benefits of nanotechnology to benefit of the global economy, society, and the environment. Clearly, this is very, very important. I think it was Aristotle that talked about the difference between a theoretical and a practical science. The theoretical is the acquisition of knowledge, the practical is the application of knowledge. And I would say clearly here we're in that latter state, the application of knowledge. There's some really fascinating things that are occurring. I was doing a little bit of research before I came out here, and of course, you know, when you think about it, what is going on? A lot of it is connected to something that, again, Andre talked about earlier. There's this vision. Now, Can anyone here tell me what this really translates to? It's kind of a giveaway because Andre talked about it earlier in his talk, if you were listening. But what is the vision that is laid out in tox testing in the 21st century? In just your words. Anyone want to just tell me what it is? I know someone knows. Yes, please.
No animal testing.
No animal testing. Anybody else want to throw in? What you see it as mean? And clearly, we're talking about this. This is this vision. We're all a part of it. What does it mean to you? Anyone else want? Yes, please.
Finding generalities.
Finding generalities. Okay. Give me an example.
That you can use a circumscribed set of assays or changes in the biological system and understand more complex systems.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I'll
In vitro,
yes.
in vitro, in vivo.
Okay, in vitro and vivo. Well, we could go on like this, but you get the gist of what we're talking. There's a lot here to be excited about. I was looking for this vision, and I came across this particular article, and I thought it had a fairly good ring to it. That the National Academy of Sciences publication, Toxicity Testing in the 21st Century, a Vision and a Strategy, proposes a paradigm shift in toxicology from current animal-based testing toward the application of emerging technologies, i.e., assays based on human cells and non-mammalian models, high-throughput testing, omics approach, system biology, and computational modeling. So a lot of everything that we've been talking about. And this is, in fact, when you look at it, this is truly a fantastic vision. But you know, there's some interesting things. On this campus, I was reading about the lab on a chip, and it's the work that's occurring in Dr. Orzon's laboratory. It's fascinating. And you think about what that would mean for diagnostic capabilities in developing countries. And then you looked at this work that the Weiss Institute, and they're looking at this whole concept of organ on a chip. So looking at linking 10 human organs on a chip to mimic the whole body physiology. And if you start thinking about it, this is the lung on a chip, which makes use of living human cells, mimics the lung's tissue interface and breathing motions. This unique platform can help ensure that safe and effective therapeutics are identified sooner, and effective or toxic ones are rejected early in the development process. There's a lot of very exciting things. If you want to go online and look at the video on this, it's quite feeling. But as I looked, I then found this. And this was kind of this early artist conception shows a microbrain reactor being developed at Vanderbilt. So given the differences in cellular biology in the brains of rodents and humans, development of a brain model that contains neurons and all three barriers between blood, brain, and cerebral spinal fluid using entirely human cells will represent a fundamental advance in and of itself. And when I read a little closer, what it said about that is this bioreactor is aimed at reproducing the brain's microenvironment in a device about the size of a grain of rice. I was just kind of blown away. We're looking at what we're thinking about in the future. But one of the things about the future is obviously this is not going to be a sprint. It's going to be a long journey. And so while we're on that long journey, I'm still being asked every day for decisions. What do I need to do? What do I need to do in order to test the product integrity, to put it on the market, to ensure workplace safety? There are lots of questions being asked. So let's explore that a little bit. One of the members of the NES committee that developed that journey document, Mel Anderson, talked about the toxicity testing transformation is now in progress. It will take clear shape over the next 5 years, become solidly rooted over a 10 to 15 year time frame, and become institutionalized within 20 to 25 years. So what would you say? What timeline would you predict? Does that sound reasonable? Does that sound too short? Is it too long? And what do we do in the interim? How do we make decisions while we're waiting to arrive at that end spot, at the vision? Well, I would suggest, going back to my earlier slide, there are three things we want to look at. We want to make sure that the information, the data that we're developing is credible and reliable. We want to try to ensure that there are government policies, national and state, that are receptive, and those that are using information, making decisions, should have a comprehensive, systematic way of doing that, so that we have consistency and assurance in the decisions that are being made. Scientific credibility. I mean, to me, this is really a big one. So we will see, as we've talked about earlier, there are a lot of collaborative efforts currently underway to generate what's going to be needed to arrive at our vision state. And, we're going to see this happening. One of the real challenges we have is how do we make sure that that information that's being provided, that's being utilized, is in fact credible. It is based upon sound science, and that we in fact can reproduce it, we can utilize it. I think when you think about this information, clearly it needs to be credible, reproducible, responsive, reliable, but trustworthy is one I'll throw in. It's very critical. And it's something that all of you that are creating, generating this data, that we must have an area of trust that comes around this. Otherwise, you'll have mistrust. And sometimes when you talk about collaboration, achieving the vision, trust can really be the lubricant to make it all occur. If you think about the way in which the public will demand this, you think of the discussions we have today, and I have colleagues that are really committed, that are producing incredible information. And some of you might also be working on projects where you've gotten funding from an industrial source. And the thought that that funding would mean that in some way it would bias your research, or that your research should not be considered, that's happening a lot. So again, trustworthy is very important when we think about this. So let's assume that we're all able to resolve this first aspect, and we have this credible information, it's reliable, trustworthy, and we can now use it. Then the question becomes, what about the government policies? Do they allow you to do that? I think you can look at both the research and the regulatory, and I'm only going to focus on a few examples at the national level here. And if you look at the research, there's a lot that has happened when you think about the National Nanotech Initiative. If you look at the 2013 federal budget, that's about a little under $2 billion, but the cumulative investment that the U.S. has made since 2001, it's now over $18 billion. When you look at the investment in EHS since 2005, we're now close to $750 million. I can remember very clearly on an effort, I think Lynn Berkson, maybe she's outside, but Lynn helped along with some NGOs, industry, as well as academics to push for increased funding for EHS research. We now, when we look at the 2012 NNI budget, we know that there are at least 15 agencies conducting research and 25 agencies that are on that. So there's a collaborative effort there to make sure we're doing the priority research. When we think of regulatory, I think that in 2011, President Obama issued Executive Order 13563, and it basically talked about our regulatory system must protect public health, welfare, and safety, and our environment while promoting economic growth, innovation, competitiveness, and jobs creation. It must be based on the best available science. Now, it's nice to have this overriding policy statement, but then there are key principles that the agencies need to then take and put this into executive departments and agencies having to do with nanotechnology. and this was June of 2011. And it talked about the fact that existing regulatory statutes provide a firm foundation for the regulation and oversight of nanomaterials. So if you're talking about in the healthcare arena, if you're looking at a new drug, a new pharmaceutical, irrespective of the technology in which it was delivered, it will have to go through the FDA approval process. If you're looking at industrial chemicals, and we're looking at the Toxic Substance Control Act. But then in exercising their authorities, agencies should seek to use the best available science and technical information to take into account the unique properties and behaviors associated with nanomaterials. This goes directly to the key point of the credible information and how agencies should, in fact, take that into consideration. The best available science. Very supportive. But then, to ensure scientific integrity, base their decisions on the best available scientific evidence, separating purely scientific judgment from judgments of policy to the extent feasible. This is a really critical one, because there are a lot of times where agencies have risk-based mandatory statutes, and they're being asked to address social economic concerns or preferences. And this, to me, is saying that you should really look at using the best available science, because once we sway from that and we go to preferences or perceptions, then, of course, it makes it very difficult to try to make sound, responsible decisions. And lastly, this conversation I was having with a colleague this morning at breakfast, is that nanomaterials should not be deemed or identified as intrinsically benign or harmful in the absence of supporting scientific evidence, and regulatory action should be based on such scientific evidence. So I think it's very critical that we have these types of policies and principles, because if we don't, then we're going to be missing one of the critical three legs, one of this three-legged stool. Now, research and regulatory is happening in other places than just here. I know Eileen mentioned the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in one of her slides, and I've had the privilege of the last 5 years of leading the industry delegation to these meetings at the OECD on nanotechnology, and we have the working party on manufactured nanomaterials. And as you can see here, this particular working party is to promote international cooperation in the human health and environmental safety aspects of manufactured nanomaterials among member countries and certain non-member countries in accordance with the outreach policy of the Chemicals Committee. And when it talks about non-outreach policy, the OECD is a group that was established in 1961. Its headquarters in Paris. It currently has 34 major countries, the most developed countries of the world, are members. And to be a member, your country must be committed to democracy and the market economy. But it also has a number of observers. And most of the countries, Russia, India, China, are all observers, and they're part of this group as well. Now, one of the things that they've been looking at in this research and regulatory arena is they've had two programs. One, which we call the Phase One Exploratory. I think in Andre's slides earlier, he talked about the materials that were chosen at the OECD for consideration. There were 14 of them. And these were really materials that we said at that point in time are in commerce. And we were looking at, so we made these material selection. We then developed a guidance document which had 49 endpoints. And we allowed people to meet these endpoints either by generating data, utilizing information, or saying the endpoint was not applicable to that material in its application. It was looking at testing, OECD official test guidelines, whether or not they were appropriate for nanomaterials. And then actually countries agreed to sponsor, and they selected materials to do testing on. And these are these dossier preparations. This phase of work, which has been going on for the last 4 years, is to be completed and reported out at the December meeting of this working party. There are at least 7 particular materials where we've had dossiers developed. I cannot tell you that each dossier is the same, nor that they have a template that they must meet. So a real question is going to be, how do you communicate the data that has been generated under these different programs? And if they're not communicated in a comparable way, then there could be a lot of confusion and misunderstanding. So that's the work. The next phase they're entering into, though, is looking at focusing on issues of regulatory relevance. And here what they've established is the first program of work was really good. It was aimed at the intrinsic characteristics of the nanomaterial. But now we have to start focusing on key issues that are of regulatory relevance. The first one was on inhalation toxicity. That was done in the Netherlands. Environmental fate, equal toxicity. And then this year, most recently, the PhysChem property one was down in Mexico. And there are 3 additional ones. Doing toxicity in Canada in September, toxicity mechanism issues in South Korea, and characterization of nanomaterials. The U.S. is hosting that, and it'll be March of 2014. And this is very important because what it realized is that for this group to be effective, they really would have to have the experts in these various areas come in to talk about what's of regulatory relevance. It couldn't just be the working party, a group of us that are more generalists. And so the information coming out will be very critical for the decisions that these member countries will make as it relates to these areas. We have the major responsible people at EPA, Maria Dor and Phil Sayer, represent the U.S. You can go to the other key countries, and their principal regulatory officials are there as well. So it's a very important group. So let me just talk about the last part of what I'd like to talk about and spend more time on is something just fairly important to me. It's actually what we use internally for making all of our decisions. I've talked about the need to have credible, reliable information, to have supportive government policies, both in the regulatory and the research arena. Now I'd like to focus on this area of having a risk-based, comprehensive, systematic approach or framework to decision-making. Some of you should be aware of this. This is the risk framework for decision-making that was jointly authored by the Environmental Defense Fund and DuPont back in 2007. It was clearly designed to develop and deliver a systematic and disciplined process for identifying, managing, and reducing potential environmental safety and healthy risks of engineered nanomaterials across all stages of the product's life cycle. It offers guidance and direction. What I'm going to do now is just really focus on a couple of the steps, which I think are very critical as we talk about decision-making with the traditional and the alternative information from alternative testing strategies. First of all, I just want you to see that it's a very simplistic 6-step process, which is kind of, should be familiar. It follows existing risk paradigms, looking at describing the material, its potential application, developing what we call the profile life cycles. That's looking at the properties, the hazards, the exposure, evaluating the risks that are identified, assessing the risk through appropriate management and control measures, deciding, documenting, and acting in terms of whether you're going to proceed or discontinue. And then there's a commitment to review and adapt. And another term I heard used earlier this morning, it's an iterative process. So you're constantly assessing, prioritizing, and generating information and data. And as new information becomes available, you are utilizing that. So that's why I talk about having a very systematic, comprehensive approach to responsible decision-making. And therefore, each and every time you're going through this process, you're not discounting one, although you might have the information, something may not be applicable. And that's a very important thing to do. So I'm going to quickly go through the framework, and I'll stop on two of the steps, which I think would be very relevant for our discussion here today. So when we look at the profile, and again this is across the product's life cycle, And then, of course, if you go to the framework, it will in fact, there's a narrative for each one of these physical chemical properties and data requests that you can look at. There's a base set of information that we talk about that drive the life cycles. But it's starting with this profile of this. Then once you have, and you've gone through this, so that you're characterizing what you have, then we look at hazards in human health or safety hazards or environmental fate. And these are just examples of something you might do. And again, what we're looking at here is for each life cycle as appropriate to the stage of development. There's a big difference if we're talking about an R&D phase, if we're looking at workplace safety, or if you're talking about a commercial launch. And so the information has to be accordingly. Earlier we talked about this area of exposure. It deals, of course, with exposure, whether it's in manufacturing, the processing, the use, distribution, storage, environmental release, leaching, but also post-use management, which is something that was added by the recycling folks when we went through developing this process, looking at that. So again, thinking about the entire life stages. In terms of evaluating risk, you look at the nature, the magnitude, the probability, and you're able to then look at the risk that we're dealing with. Risk management, and for risk management, we seem to want to focus very clearly on is, can we design any risk out? That's really our first preference. When we talk about workplace safety, of course, what we're looking at is whether or not our current practices for workplace safety need to be augmented in any way because of new risks posed by these materials. And there what we have is we've added what we call our prudent practices for dealing with nanomaterials to supplement our existing practices for workplace safety. And again, it's driven by the individual materials, what you know and what you don't know. This to me is one of the most important steps, and I think it's kind of relevant to what we're talking about here today. We have this step which is called decide, document, and act. And again, that doesn't mean that you've pre-decided. What it means is based upon what you've done in the first 4 steps, you make a very serious decision. Is this something that will continue? And if so, under what conditions? And then you have to be able to document and justify whatever decision you're making. And then and only then would you be able to act. And in this place, we also consider things which are a little outside of the normal things. For instance, we will look at business, legal, or stakeholder issues, which could involve societal issues, economic considerations. And we look at all of that in terms of the decision that we would finally make. And then lastly, of course, we're always in a position of where we conduct reviews and we change as needed based upon those reviews. Now, everything needs to be reviewed. So I told you the framework was developed in 2007. Well, in 2011, the International Standards Organization came out with their framework for evaluating the risk of nanomaterials. This was an effort, a subcommittee, I think, under TC 229, and they took a little over 18 months, and they reviewed very, very critically the framework that I just talked to you about. Some of you may be familiar with Andrew Maynard, who did a review of ISO's framework. And this is kind of what Andrew had to say about the document. He says that the nanorisk evaluation published by ISO is unashamedly based on the environmental defense of the DuPont nanorisk framework. Much of the structure and content reflects that of the original, a testament to the thought and effort that went into the first document. So when you look at the ISO, you will see it's the same 6 steps that I outlined to you. And that was a group that reviewed it several years later. So we feel that we've been able to put in place a framework that can stand the test of time. That framework said very clearly on page 31 that we support the development of validated in vitro methods for applications of nanomaterials, both as complements to and where appropriate replacements for in vivo testing. And our base sets already incorporate such tests where they exist. And there was a in vitro genotox test that we used on one of the examples in the framework to show that we can incorporate it. So I think by having this type of risk-based framework, you can incorporate credible data irrespective of the sources. And you can use that for making responsible decisions about the nanomaterials. So what do I see as some of the challenges? Again, I went to the literature to look at this, and I found the following, which talked about, besides their development, the validation of testing strategy represents a major challenge, since validation principles are designed for single test methods. Current challenges for the vision include the implementation and integration of proposed technologies into an adequate new paradigm and demonstration of its predictive capability for human toxicity in comparison to current animal-based testing. I was reading from the summary of the report, and it said the following, that change often involves a pivotal event that builds on previous history and opens the door to a new era. Pivotal events in science include the discovery of penicillin, the hallucination of the DNA double helix, and the development of computers. All were marked by inauspicious beginnings, followed by unheralded advances over a period of years, but ultimately resulted in a pharmacopoeia of life-saving drugs, a map of the human genome, and a personal computer on almost everyone's desk in today's workplace. Toxicity testing is approaching such a scientific pivotal point. It is poised to take advantage of the revolutions in biology and biotechnology. Advances in toxigenomics, bioinformatics, systems biology, epigenetics, and computational toxicology could transform toxicity testing from a system based on whole animal testing to one found primarily on in vitro methods that evaluate changes in biological processes using cells, cell line, cellular components, preferable of human origin. Clearly, we face some difficult issues. However, we are making progress at integrating data from diverse technologies, endpoints, into what is effectively a system biology approach to toxicology. This can only be accomplished when comprehensive knowledge is obtained with broad coverage of chemicals and biological toxicological space. The efforts described thus far reflect the initial stages of an exceptionally complicated program, one that will take decades to fully achieve. So what do we do in the interim? How do we make decisions today? Well, going back to what I just said, one approach might be taking the credible and reliable information, using supportive government policies, all within a risk-based framework that would give us an integrated approach for responsible Nano EHS decision-making. One approach. Thank you.